Now, the three movies you're supposed to watch this week are incredibly rich in terms of its social commentary, in terms of their place in film history, and I could certainly go on and on about these movies. But of course, that might get a bit tedious. So I'm going to try to just hit what I consider to be some of the more significant points, some of the more major points about these three films. And I'll also add a few words about The Hustler. I'm sorry, about High Noon, which was not required, but an extra credit film that some of you wrote about. I won't say too much since not everyone saw it, but I think there's enough important stuff going on in there that I think it's at least worth mentioning. And if you didn't watch High Noon and do the extra credit, I hope that at some point you will watch it because it's definitely a very worthwhile movie. First off, with The Hustler, I think, considering like everything we've seen so far, I hope you noticed that in The Hustler, there's a very different tone to this movie. There's, again, a kind of darkness, a social realism that we hadn't seen in previous movies. Even in something as dark as the Double Indemnity, there is still kind of I guess we'll call a old Hollywood movie quality to those films. Whereas The Hustler, I think, feels much more contemporary. It feels like a movie that could have been made today. And just as the casting of Fred MacMurray as Walter Neff in Double Indemnity was quite a bit of a surprise, the casting of Jackie Gleason as Minnesota Fats was also a surprise. Because Jackie Gleason, for the most part, was known as a comedian. He did not do many serious roles. He was primarily known as the sort of lead in the TV show The Honeymooners. He was a well-respected comic actor, and this was really kind of his first and only real major dramatic turn. Some of you may be familiar with the movie The Color of Money starring Tom Cruise and Paul Newman, and this is essentially a sequel to The Hustler. It takes place, about 20 years after where The Hustler ended, where Fast Eddie Felson is now essentially retired and owns a little bar, and he meets up with this young kid who he sees as kind of a potential pool shark. Anyhow, if you haven't seen the movie, it's pretty good. It's definitely worth seeing, and especially since you've seen The Hustler. Alright, so getting back to The Hustler, as I've already noted, this movie has a very modern feel. In some ways, this could be a movie set in the 50s but made today, right? That it has a kind of starkness that we often associate with American independent cinema today. Maybe not necessarily the mainstream cinema, but definitely sort of the more adventurous independent cinema. One of the things is, its use of music, or maybe I should say a lack of music. There's a kind of a bareness, there's a starkness to this film that in movies like Double Indemnity or Postman Rings Twice, there's, music is used in this very kind of heavy-handed way to really get across emotions. And certainly there is backing music, this non-diegetic backing music in this movie as well, but it tends to be much more subtle. Again, it's much more in line with kind of what we expect today in modern films. The other thing, though, that I think that makes this really a modern movie, a much more contemporary style movie than a 50s style movie, is its moral ambiguity. And remember, moral ambiguity is a huge no-no during the time of the Hollywood production code. There has to be clear right and wrong. There can't be, any sense that the bad guy wins or the bad guy gets away with it, and the bad guy has to be clearly labeled as a bad guy, right? So that Walter Neff in Double Indemnity, even though he's this anti-hero that you're kind of rooting for, it's clear that he's the bad guy. He realizes he's the bad guy, and of course he gets punished for that, right? There's no sense that he's walking away with this. Phyllis Dietrichson, of course, is the super evil bad guy or woman, but Walter Neff is definitely not an innocent either. But in this case, there really is like no clearly good person, and everyone is bad on some level, and some of course more so than others. Now, on the surface, we can easily point to the character of Bert, played by George C. Scott, as being kind of the film's bad guy, the kind of source of evil in the film. And just as a side note, George C. Scott, rather amazing actor. And if you haven't had a chance to see the film Patton, I highly recommend it. It's a war film made in the late 60s, starring George C. Scott playing the title character of General Patton. A pretty amazing film, and possibly, in my opinion, one of the best war films ever made. So, getting back to The Hustler now. Again, Bert can be seen as the kind of primary source of evil in this film. But, he's not the only one. I mean, he's not the one that is wholly responsible for Sarah's death. I think, Eddie, of course, plays a huge role in it. I mean, Eddie is not this innocent who just gets suckered in. I mean, Eddie is not a good person, right? He's a terrible person. And he only becomes a good person after Sarah dies. He only becomes a better person because when he realizes that what he had allowed to happen. And Sarah herself, I mean, again, if Bert is sort of the closest to the bad person, okay, Sarah might be closest to the good person in that, she is the closest thing to an innocent. She's someone who is sort of victimized by all of this. But, she's not a sweet, innocent girl. I mean, she's this sort of, trashy kind of person who, invite strange men to her house and has sex with them. I mean, in the standards of the production code, a person like Sarah is, has to be considered out and out evil and bad. But of course, in this movie, that's not true, right? Again, this is the great little twist in this movie, that this morally corrupt person, again, a person who is an alcoholic, a person who has casual sex, that this morally corrupt person is the closest thing to a good person in this movie. Whereas Bert, who is in many ways a very straightforward, direct person, is the closest thing to a bad person. And Eddie is somewhere in between. He's part victim, but he's also part instigator. Again, he's not an innocent in any of this. If anything, if there is one person that might be considered the true innocent of the movie, the true sort of person who is outside of this sort of good and bad, is in fact Minnesota Fats, right? He's just this guy who kind of plays pool, and he has almost no moral compass. He's a person who is not ethically bad, nor is he great and ethically good. He's just this kind of neutral thing. He does what he does. There's almost a mechanical nature about his attitude, the way he conducts his life. And in a way, then, one could say that, that's one of the points of this film, that only people like Minnesota Fats can escape this sort of struggle between good and bad. And that the rest of us, we don't live as good or bad people, that the rest of us, we're always struggling in between these two things, that we're always doing terrible things to ourselves and to each other. We do things to try to redeem ourselves. But ultimately, no one is truly good, no one is truly bad. And this question of moral ambiguity is something that also comes up in The Apartment, although in a very, very different way with very different intentions. Yeah, there's something really fascinating about this movie. On the surface, it's basically a lighthearted comedy, right? It's a funny film, and I think you could almost sort of categorize it as a romantic comedy. But when you really think about what's going on in this movie, when you really think about what this movie is about, again, there's a certain darkness to this. Think about this. Jack Lemmon plays this guy who is basically loaning out his apartment to these executives who are cheating on their wives, right? They need a place to go meet with their mistresses, And even though they don't explicitly mention they're having sex, that's basically what they're doing. The audience knows that's what's happening. And I mean, it's almost as if he's running a brothel. And when you think about these characters, like again, the Shirley MacLaine character, I mean, she's essentially she's a mistress, meaning that she's sleeping with this married man. She's a homewrecker, whatever you want to call it. Back in the first and second weeks of the quarter, when we first started talking about the production code, there was a concept known as compensating moral value, and that was the idea that if there was going to be an immoral act in a movie, that immoral act had to be condemned. That it was very clear that in the sort of culture of that movie, of the characters in that film, that that act was considered a bad thing. But when you think about it here, the only thing that's really considered bad is the way Shirley MacLaine's character is being treated by Fred MacMurray's character, right? That there's never this condemnation of infidelity. No one is condemning these executives for cheating on their wives. It's almost as if it's just kind of generally accepted. And that, I think, is, again, when you think about it, a really dark kind of comedy. And the thing is, in this movie, there is, again, no innocent. There's no one even like Minnesota Fats from The Hustler, because Jack Lemmon's character, you might consider him to be the closest thing to the innocent, but as this particular movie poster points out, I mean, Jack Lemmon, he's doing this thing that he knows on some level might be wrong or is probably wrong, but he's doing it because it's in furtherance of his career, right? They're always telling him, hey, buddy, you did this for us and we'll get you promoted. And of course he gets promoted. And, he gets promoted at a pace much quicker than anyone else in the company. It's not because of the quality of work that he does, it's because of the favors that he gives, these immoral favors. So in this sense, everyone in this film, by the standards of the Hollywood production code, are tainted. Shirley MacLaine is an adulteress, all the executives are adulterers, and even Jack Lemmon's character, who, for the most part, he's supposed to be the hero of the movie, the person we are supposed to relate to and root for. I mean, he's basically an enabling pimp that allows all of this to happen. Now, to some extent, the thesis for The Hustler, one might argue, is that we live in a morally compromised world in which good and bad are never quite clear. That there is no clear distinction, there's no line easily dividing good and bad. Right. So now, if that's the thesis for The Hustler, for The Apartment, I would say that what The Apartment is trying to tell us is that we live in a world that has become, to some extent, so dehumanized that sort of personal ethical positions no longer exist. That humanity, in some ways, has been sucked out of society, and we no longer care for people as people, but we sort of think about people in purely utilitarian ways. That is, a person is only worth as much as that person can do for you. Now think about the opening shot of The Apartment, the establishing shot, which is, well, it's not this, it's the aerial shot of New York City, right? And as the camera is sort of panning across this large aerial shot of New York City, you have Jack Lemmon's voiceover talking about, well, this city has X number of people and, X number of women, X number of children, that he's able to break down New York by sort of basic numbers. Right. This, in a way, tells us from the very, very beginning that this is a movie about sort of dehumanizing people. That this is not a city full of individuals. This is a city full of statistics. And so it's no surprise then that the first interior shot we get is this shot of the office. It's an extreme wide shot that sort of makes people seem like they're kind of robots, right? They're all neatly aligned in rows. They're doing very similar tasks. All their desks are identical. There's no sense of individuality amongst them. This kind of extreme wide shot is used often in films. In the film Pink Floyd's The Wall, for example, in that scene where the children are sort of being processed into kind of meat, Uh, they're seen marching along again in this kind of extreme wide shot that shows all these different people, individuals whose individuality is lost, and there's just simply anonymous parts of a group. And this kind of loss of individuality was an important subject for sociologists in the 1950s, in post war America, because what was happening is that after World War II was like the emergence of these kind of large corporations and large companies where people started to do these menial tasks, right? That people in before World War II, a lot of people worked outdoors, they worked at factories, but now there were sort of more and more people were working inside offices, pushing along paper, being part of a larger system that they really knew nothing about. And so one sociologist calls this the phenomenon of the organization man. If you ever watch sitcoms from the 1950s, like Leave It to Beaver, what you often see is like the father, wake up in the morning, he goes to work, and then in the evening he comes home. What you are never told is what kind of work he does. And that's because, again, there was this sort of idea that at this point it doesn't really matter because you're not really sure what it is you do. You just kind of show up and you stamp your papers and you pass along this and you pass along that. But there isn't any great sense of meaning or purpose to the work. And movies were made about this, much more obvious movies, like the one with Gregory Peck called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. And the sense that he's just a sort of anonymous person. He's like every other man in the gray flannel suit. That all these men just march to work like machines. And in addition to the sort of change in the workplace, the sort of rise of what we might call the culture of the cubicle, there was also the rise of the suburbs, right? That, prior to World War II, most Americans either lived in the country or in the city. Think about like places in South King County today, like Federal Way and Auburn. Back in 1950, these were all farms. And houses started to develop, after World War II, and these things, today they're known as the suburbs, but it was a fairly new invention. And in the suburbs, there was this kind of mass-produced housing, which is why, like in certain suburban neighborhoods, houses tend to look very similar to one another because they're all kind of created at one time. The designs are similar because it's cheaper to make houses that way, right? If you go into the city and you look at older neighborhoods, you'll see that the houses don't have the same look, that every house looks different because they're built one at a time. Now, some of you might be familiar with the movie Welcome to Pleasantville, which was, I think just came out maybe 10 years ago, starring Reese Witherspoon and Tobey Maguire, and they're playing off of this kind of 50s era conformity where two modern American kids get sucked into this sort of mythical Pleasantville, this 1950s world based on a 1950s sitcom, and on the surface everyone seems happy, but they're all kind of miserable because there's no sense of individuality. They're all kind of fitting into whatever roles have been created for them. So getting back to the apartment then, the sort of lack of any kind of moral authority, the lack of any sense of ethics, one could argue is simply a result of this conforming culture. It's a result of this dehumanizing culture that, again, looks at people not as individuals but as parts of a machine, as tools of a machine. And essentially that's what everyone is involved in here in the apartment, that they all work for the corporation, they're all involved in the corporation, and because the corporation is a kind of ethical, morally neutral thing, they have no sense of a moral compass as people. Now, I want to sort of quickly switch gears here and just very briefly talk about Jack Lemmon and the role he plays here in the apartment. This role was something that Billy Wilder very specifically created for Jack Lemmon. Billy Wilder, who directed Double Indemnity, had also directed a movie called Some Like It Hot, starring Marilyn Monroe and Tony Curtis, and of course Jack Lemmon. And when Billy Wilder worked with Jack Lemmon Some Like It Hot, he became so enamored with Jack Lemmon's acting and his comedic style that when he began to work on his next movie, he essentially decided, he needed to make a movie with Jack Lemmon. So that when he was working on this, the entire premise of the film was, basically built on finding the right movie for Jack Lemmon to do. Alright, so I'm going to end this section here, and then in the next section I will talk about On the Waterfront and say a few things also about High Noon.